Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Searching for the Spirit Bear, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Marlo Shaw. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Marlo, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. This is a pretty special opportunity to come up on here and speak a little bit about the place that I'm from, and one of the really special critters that can be found in this region. Yeah, welcome everybody. Welcome to people who have been to many webinars, to people who have traveled with me, and people who I have not met yet, and the folks who are new to this program. It's a pretty special thing that we're able to do here. So. Yeah, we're doing a presentation on searching for the spirit bear, and maybe what I'll do is I'll first show you a little bit of an outline of what I want to talk to you about today, and then I'll give you a little bit of an introduction about myself. So there's a number of topics that I'd like to cover today, because we haven't really spoken on our webinars about this region. I would like to do an overview of many topics. So there's going to be some maps and figures that you see here that you probably are hoping that we hang on to for a little bit longer, but that's a good thing. Just let Rob know that you want to learn about one particular topic that we covered today in more depth, and we can dive in another time. Yeah, so we're going to talk about, what is a spirit bear? Really, where are they? How many are there? Where are they? And why do they still exist, right? So, why does that color phase even persist in the environment? And then we'll talk a little bit about the conservation issues in the particular area that they can be found. But first, I'll do a little intro. I'll tell you guys a bit of a story. Yeah, so my name is Marlo Shaw. I've traveled with a bunch of you guys before. If you've traveled with me, then this little photo on the right-hand side probably isn't very surprising. Walking through the woods with a big old bag, a book in hand with my little multi-tool and a fern, and carrying a massive slug on my fingers there, chatting about the forest with the people. And so this is a picture in the Great Bear Rainforest. I've been working in this region. Well, this is really where I got my start guiding. I got started guiding here in 2017, so it's coming up to almost 10 years for me here. And I've worked with, with several different companies on this coastline, looking for grizzly bears and black bears and spirit bears, but also just enjoying all aspects of the environment here. And I'll be leading a trip in 2026 for NatHab in the Great Bear Rainforest. So yeah, place that's close to my heart, the home of the spirit bear also. And I'll say this, that before I started working on the coast, I was the only person in my family who had not seen a spirit bear, which was the wildest thing because, of course, I'm the bear fanatic and I've just been totally obsessed with them. I spent a lot of time going out and looking for them. And, some of the places that they live are very, very remote. And other times people near my hometown, they'll see them on the side of the road. And I just hadn't gotten lucky yet. And so I was there with my very first group, sitting by the river in the place where we thought our chance to see the spirit bear was going to be the highest. And we decided we were going to wait there all day. So we had an 8-hour period that we were going to sit beside the river. There's lots of salmon there. And, for, quiet enough and still enough and patient enough, hopefully something will walk by. Maybe it's a black bear, or maybe it's a white bear. And so we're sitting there and the rain is kind of falling and, everyone is kind of really settling into the silence. And, it'd been a few hours and, we're just kind of snacking and watching the water go by, and your mind starts to get into quite this like very peaceful rhythm as you're sitting by a river and just watching the water go by. And there's some guests that describe this to me, and I certainly had this feeling where you kind of come to terms with just the being there, and maybe the fact that we maybe wouldn't have an encounter with one of the rarest creatures that you could see in this world. And then sure enough, just as that thought crosses your mind, this beautiful, beautiful white bear emerges from upriver. And when you've been waiting that long on the side of the river, you know, whatever it might be for your particular group. Maybe it's at the very end of the day that you end up getting your encounter. It almost doesn't feel real that it's happening because it's so anticipated. They're so rare. They're so beautiful, and it's just such a wild, wild landscape. And so it was a really, even for myself as a person who's guided in many different regions, I've guided, I don't even know what it is, maybe 5 or 6 different regions for NatHabs only. Yeah, it was an extra special experience for me that was very, very quieting for my mind and, mind, body, and soul. Everything was there in that moment, and I felt it with the group as well. We were all there. So here's the first spirit bear that I got to encounter. Here's my documentation of, our first moment of us seeing each other, really. And her name is Warrior. She got that name from the Git-Gat guide, the indigenous guide that we were with, that had seen her a few times previously, and she's got this big kind of scratch on her nose, so that's why she's called Warrior. So that's my first spirit bear story, and I've been lucky enough to see quite a few since then. But I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about all these topics that we discussed in the outline now, and we can get to some questions afterwards. So let's jump into it. And when we're talking about what is a spirit bear, let's go back to the very beginning, just very briefly. Let's talk about where bears really came from. So all carnivores came from one kind of common ancestor, and that ancestor would be from the family Myiacidae, and that family would have looked kind of like almost like a weasel, remnant of a weasel. And about 55 million years ago or so, I remember in geological timescales, it's like this, right? That this has all happened. But about 55 million years ago, we had a massive split in the carnivores, carnivorous mammals, where they split into 2 groups, kind of the feline-like mammals or carnivores, and the canid-like mammals or carnivores. And that's what this chart is showing you. So we've got the canids here that are kind of all of our red markers. So that's your bears and your seals and your weasels, and then your feline-like animals. So, you would have something more like your cougars and your jaguars there. So that's where bears came from originally, but certainly they didn't look like their weasel-like ancestors. There's been a lot of change since then. So if we went to about 20 million years ago, our very first ancestor of what we would think of as a true bear started to exist. And shortly after that, about 19 million years ago, there was a split between that first true bear that was quite small, probably about the size of a medium-sized dog. There was a split between them and the giant panda. So the giant panda has the most ancient genes of all of the currently existing bear species. And then our newest genes that have been created through speciation have been the ones the bears that exist in North America. So if we look at the international distribution of bears across the world, I could do a whole presentation just on this map. We can see our 8 different bear species. We've got the 4 species that exist in Asia, and then the 3 species that exist in North America, and then our 1 species in South America. And we're going to hone into our North American species that we see here. So here's a couple maps of our continent. Our map on the left is a distribution of grizzly bears here. Ursus arctos, right, is the most international and farthest reaching bear species across the world. So just coming back to this other map, you can see the red across the northern hemisphere is where you can find Ursus arctos, and grizzly bears or brown bears. So in North America, historically, their range would have existed much further south and east than it currently does. So this map on the left side, we can see the green is the historical range of the grizzly bear, and then the yellowy mustard is kind of the current range. And so there's some reasons for that, and I'm sure that there's some people on this call who have done trips to go travel to see grizzly bears in the wild. One of the biggest reasons is because we just really don't coexist very well with those animals. So where populations of people are a lot less dense, they tend to thrive a little bit more. And then our range map on the right side was our distribution of black bears, or historical distribution of black bears. So we've got black bears that do reach across Canada, and the government of Canada seems to think that about 1/4 of our black bears in our country are living in British Columbia. The habitat is that wild and readily available to them. There's lots of food available to them. And there are areas where the population is much more dense. So if we thought of British Columbia, just as a province standing alone, the black bears that are existing in kind of the more eastern, flatter areas on the east side of the Coast Mountains, their population could be one bear for every 20 kilometers squared or so. And sorry, everybody, I'm speaking Canadian here. Maybe you could call it 12 or 13 miles. Then on the coast, as you're on the west side of the coast of British Columbia, your density gets much tighter, and there's a reason for that. It's because there's more food available, there's more mates available, and the topography is also a lot more challenging to move around more readily, right? Because it's very mountainous there. And so the black bear population becomes as dense as one black bear for every 2 kilometers squared, which is pretty dense. So in the province of BC, it's thought that we have about 120 to 160,000 black bears. And of course, that's a big discrepancy. But of course, when you're trying to count a population of a species that's living in an exceptionally remote and dense, like vegetatively dense landscape, you can't just go out and just count them, right? So all of our population numbers, are based on models. From some of the data that's actually been able to be ground truthed out there. Some models extrapolated outwards. Just catching us all up on the bear front as well. The difference between the black bear and the grizzly bear is, I'm just going to say it very, very quickly, but they in BC, they will exist in a lot of the same habitat and they will eat a lot of the same foods. But they have some slightly different adaptations. So the grizzly bear has that big hump on their back and some longer claws, and they are more adapted to digging for different food items that they've evolved to like. They also have a more curved profile to the face, the grizzly bears, whereas black bears have a much more flat profile to their face. And then if you're trying to identify one in the wild, another thing that you could use is the size of the ear. So the black bears have much larger ears and grizzly bears have much shorter, smaller ears. People often say size and color is a way that they would tell a bear species in the wild, but it's not the best indicator because, of course, you have very large black bears and then you have young or smaller grizzly bears in some areas. And then when it comes to color, there's huge variation for both grizzly bears and black bears. So the grizzly bears can be on the coast of British Columbia can be very, very dark, almost black. And you do get a few blonde individuals, but like I said, it just depends on the individual what they look like. And then for black bears, you can have really big color variations. You can have a black bear that is much more brown looking. So that's this picture on the right-hand side. In British Columbia, we like to call those cinnamon bears. So here's a picture of a cinnamon bear. Has been sightings of bears that have been claimed to be a little bit blue in their color, and that's this picture on the bottom there. They're extremely rare to see, and they're thought to be mostly living in the very, very far northerly reaches of the black bear range in British Columbia and the Yukon. So you might find some individuals that have this kind of like blondie, gray color that in a certain light could look blue, and those bears have also been called the glacier bears. And then, of course, you have the spirit bear. So all the bears in this slide are all black bears, Ursus americanus. They're all the same species. Now, the spirit bear has been thought to be a subspecies in some circles, but they can still very easily mate with black bears that are black, and they definitely do. And they create fertile young, and so they are managed in British Columbia largely the same as black bears are, with an exception of a couple of wildlife management areas that we are protecting from the residential hunting of black bears, even the black bears in those particular areas. So yes, the spirit bear is a white black bear, white colored black bear, which kind of seems a little bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? But yeah, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about how that has come to be. In just a moment here, we're going to have to go back to your guys' grade 10 genetics class, unfortunately. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'll try to create an explanation here. So how many of them are white and why are they white? Are two questions that we want to answer. How many is a great question, and the short answer is we don't really know. There hasn't been a fully comprehensive genetic study across the entire range of where the spirit bear gene is thought to exist. If you do some research on it, you're going to find lots of different numbers. 1 in 10 bears, 10%, or somewhere between 300 and 400 individuals, 200 or less individuals. Depending on when that information was recorded, you're going to get those different numbers. And the more information that we find out about the genetic distribution of these white bears, the more that we realize that we were really overestimating the wild population, and it's probably somewhere less than 200 individuals that are actually showing that they're white. So let's go to our biology lesson here for a second, and then we'll talk about, I'll show you guys some maps about genetic distribution that have been created. So you could think about the white color phase, or the white fur, as being kind of like a recessive gene in a human. So that would be like having blonde hair or blue eyes, right? So if you have two parents that have that recessive gene, then there is a chance that could show up. And that chance is created basically according to if that gene is a double allele or only a single allele of that recessive gene. So let's go through this little diagram here. So on the top left, we have two parents that have the double dominant gene. So we've got two little black bears on the top of our square, and they have two capital A's, which means there's two alleles that each individual is going to have for the color of their fur, and the dominant allele is black. And so if they have two capital A's, that means they have two of the black genes, and all of their offspring are going to be black no matter what, 100%. Okay. If we go to the middle right square, we have two black parents that have both a dominant gene and a recessive gene. So they have a capital A and a lowercase a. And we can see the different genetic makeups that their offspring could make. They could have an offspring that comes out with two dominant genes, or a 50% chance of having an offspring that is one dominant and one recessive gene, or they could have an offspring of 25%. 25% chance of having the double recessive gene. So these black bears, these black bears, are really of interest of the people who are trying to determine what the genetic distribution is of these spirit bears, because there's no way to know that they are holding this recessive gene unless we get genetic material from them. Because when we just look at them, we say, oh, that's a black bear, right? But they might be holding on to something that's really, really rare. And so that's what some of these studies have gone out to find is how many of the black bears in an area by percentage are carrying this gene but not showing white. And then of course, if you go to the very bottom right scenario, if you have two white bears, then you know that you have two individuals that have a double recessive gene, and 100% of their offspring are going to be white. Right outside of Terrace, British Columbia, which is where I live, That's the place where you're going to fly into if you end up doing the Natural Habitat Adventures trip. So right outside of where I live this spring, there was big news that there was a black bear mother bear, and she was a black bear. She had 3 cubs. 2 of the cubs were black, and 1 of them was white. And as some people who are bear nerds know, that bears can be promiscuous. They can have cubs from different parents. But also, if she was a black bear that mated with a white bear, then there's basically a 50-50% chance that she's going to end up having having a white cub. And that's if she's with a black bear that has one recessive gene. So we don't need to know this in crazy depth, but some folks who are familiar with this world, this would be very simple for you. And for other folks who are kind of new to this, just think about it like, having kids that have blue eyes, blonde hair, or even red hair. Sometimes red hair shows up in a family after many people don't have red hair. And that's because that hidden gene has been kind of behind the scenes for a few different reproductions. So there's that. Okay, so moving forward, where are these bears? Where can we find them? Well, some of you guys might know the region called the Great Bear Rainforest. And this is an area that is absolutely massive. It's about 6.4 million hectares. So it's about the size of Ireland or so. It's about 400 kilometers from the north end of it to the south. And it's an area that is extremely mountainous, remote, forested, and really there are very few roads that access the area that these bears are living in. This region is just full of fjords that were carved by the last glaciation, where on the west coast of British Columbia, off of the coast mountains, big masses of ice carved out these fjords. So it's very kind of reminiscent of maybe some people have traveled to Norway. So these fjords are very deep and mountains jut right out from the ocean. Yeah, so I'm going to show you a series of maps and I'm going to flip through them fairly quickly. But you can look here at British Columbia and where it's situated on the west coast. And you can see this mountain range coming up on the left-hand side of the province. And the region that we're talking about when we talk about the Great Bear Rainforest is just below the Alaska Panhandle, all the way down to the northern tip of Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island's that big kind of sausage-shaped island that's just to the west of Vancouver. Now, I'm going to show you a series of maps. The best way to quickly get yourself oriented to where we're talking about is if you can remember where the placement of Haida Gwaii is. So Haida Gwaii is the triangular, like upside down triangle archipelago of islands that is off the west coast of British Columbia. So if you look at the central west coast of British Columbia and come west, you're going to see that triangle, and that will help get you situated for where we're looking at when we look at these maps coming up. Now, this region became very famous in the year 2016, and part of that was because Canada had a really kind of interesting management plan that was created for this region. So it's not just an ecosystem, it's also very much a political boundary. So I'll show you where the management plan was created for. And after that, there was a lot of interest that was created in this area. Tourism ended up increasing. Lots of people were coming for photographic opportunities. And then there was a creation of this movie in the year 2019, the IMAX film for the Great Bear Rainforest. So they talked to some of the major people in the area that were working with spirit bears and just sharing the story of this very unique and special place in the world. If you think about the temperate rainforests that still exist on our planet today, British Columbia has about 1/4 of the surface area of those temperate rainforests. It's an absolutely enormous area. And this region that's highlighted in the dark green there, you can see that that's where the official kind of Great Bear Rainforest Management Area region is. However, that temperate rainforest also exists on Haida Gwaii, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and many of the species associated with that will reach down well into Washington and Oregon as well, and up into Alaska. So think about it as as a political boundary as well. It's not a strictly environmental boundary. And why did we create this? Well, this was a time in 2016 where there was some concern about several things. One was that increasing oil tanker interest in this region, lessons that were learned from the big spill that happened up in Alaska, and kind of the rampant expansion of logging of all old growth forests on the coast of BC. There's some really, really valuable lumber there. And there was also, at the time in the conservation circles, a lot of discussion about what it means to use ecosystem-based management as an approach to conserve an area. So let's not look at this particular park or this particular fjord or this particular river. Let's look at this area as a whole and make a management plan as a whole. And that's a really ambitious thing for this region because, again, it's so remote, but it is also it is home to quite a variety of different Indigenous groups, and those groups were meant to be involved in the creation of this 2016 wildlife management area that was created by the province. So these maps, I'll just quickly show you. You can see that the depth of the green on each map of the coastline is showing a higher percentage of forest lands that are protected from old growth logging in perpetuity. So you can see in 2005, we had very little areas that were protected. And for a while, that didn't really matter too much because the regions were so remote that it wasn't very economically viable to be able to be in there and logging quite as much. The places that were most at risk were the ones that were adjacent to communities. But of course, as you are going through an area where you are taking kind of the best possible product, it becomes more and more valuable to go further and further afield. And so, there's been a lot of pressure for a long time all along the coast to have more protections for logging. The Great Barrier Rainforest Agreement was a big part of that. Moving on to another map so we can see where we are. Haida Gwaii is there. When we're looking at the central coast of British Columbia, you can, on the very bottom of the map, you can see just the northern tip of Vancouver Island coming up. And then we've got a whole mess of polygons. So some folks who have been trips in other places of the world, maybe you've been to this website or been shown this by your guide. It's a website called nativeland.org, and you can look anywhere in the world and you can see who the indigenous people were or are in the area that you're living in. And so what we can see here on this map is that it's really complicated in the area that you would be visiting if you came to the Great Barrier Rainforest to try to find the white bear. And speaking of the white bear in this regard, many of the nations here also really thought of this animal as being very special and supernatural. And it was respected as a rare creature, and it wasn't one that was harvested. And there's a lot of these nations are still trying to pressure the government to create areas where we can make sure that there is absolutely no hunting in those places, so that they can also protect the black bears that might have that white gene, right? But one thing that's really unique about British Columbia, even in the context of colonization and Indigenous people, is that the vast majority of the nations in our province they don't have treaties. So the people who are living currently on that landscape, who are settlers, they're living on unceded land. There was never an agreement with the federal government to determine where the official boundary or borders of those people's traditional lands or territories were. And so, of course, we've got these maps that are showing that there's some overlap in some of the territories of these people, and that is creates some complications when it comes to land use management. And in British Columbia, we're trying really hard to create more opportunities for the peoples who are living on the coast to have more sovereignty over their traditional territories, to create treaties that are fair, and to make land use management decisions. And part of that was the Great Barrier Rainforest Agreement. So we can see here now, if you look at Haida Gwaii right now, we're back on the coast. We can see all these beautiful fjords and rivers and lake systems. And this is another rendition of the last map that we looked at. It's just a simplified version, and you can see each of the borders of these territories are kind of misted or faded, and that's just to show you that it's not as simple as just kind of drawing a straight line when you're trying to include multiple nations. Yeah, so we can see that the region specifically where the black bear gene is existing is a place that is very much international when it comes to Indigenous heritage. And so it's definitely a joint effort on managing those areas. I'm going to show you this map is quite complicated and we don't need to get too crazy in depth, but truly this is what came of the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement. So you can see the park boundaries here that are in green, and then significantly the orange boundaries are the biodiversity, mining, and tourism areas that were allocated for, in part, Indigenous peoples who had territories in those areas to be able to conduct economic practices in those particular spots. So this was a pretty historic document that was created. And it is pretty special, and I think it's important that people know a little bit about that as we're talking about the critters that exist in this place. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the spirit bear and where it lives in this landscape. So our map on the right side, if you can find Butedale, which is on an island that looks like a sideways eye almost. I wonder if I can I can't put my mouse there. But Butedale is just below Hartley Bay, down and to the right from Hartley Bay. Okay, that island is called Princess Royal Island. And you can find Princess Royal Island very easily on the map on the left side because it's where the darkest red exists. Okay, so that kind of puts us in place. And now if you zip back over to the right side, if you can find Kitimat Village, Kitimat, and Terrace on the top right corner of the screen, that's where you're landing for the Spirit Bear trip, and then you drive to Kitimat, and then you get on the ship there, and then you'll take the ship down all the way to Bella Bella on the bottom right side, and then the next group might get on the boat and then go all the way back up to Kitimat and Terrace. And so this is the region where you guys are going to be spending time. And then to tell you more about this map that's on the right hand side, or the left hand side, sorry, with all these red splotches on it. This is the best study that's been conducted on the genetic distribution of the white gene on the west coast of British Columbia. So as far as we know, scientifically, this is where the white gene exists. And when I say white gene, it doesn't even really necessarily mean the density of the white bears. So the study was trying to determine also not only, where are the white bears, but where are the black bears that have that recessive gene. And so as we get to areas that are darker red, the concentration of that gene is much higher. And we get into places like Princess Royal Island, the one that looks like a sideways eye, and the one that's just north of it that looks like a wonky little triangle. That's Gribble Island. Those places, it could easily be, 20 to 40% of the bears that are there could be holding the gene. So it's quite dense in those areas. But one thing that I'll show you that's significant to our kind of understanding of where these bears exist and what their density is if you look at the northern end of the red splotches there, it's quite a hard line that exists there. And that's because that's the edge of the research area, the study area. It would be quite easy to see that further beyond that boundary, both to the east and to the north, the range persists. And it's well known that those white bears also exist well inland to Terrace and even further to Hazelton. Remember, that's how my family members all saw spirit bears. They just saw them on the side of the road between and basically from Terrace and 1 hour driving anywhere outward. So we've got a big kind of gap in our knowledge still of where we think these bears exist. But one really great finding that was found from this study was There is one region that is exceptionally important for this particular gene to exist, and there's also discrepancy between the protected areas that have been created in the last number of years and where that gene exists. So again, if we're looking at this white splotchy map, you can see the polygons that have kind of sideways diagonal cuts through them, and that's where the parkland is on the coastline. So we've got a lot of places where the white bears are existing or could exist, and they're not protected. And so that was one of the big arguments and findings from this study. How did they conduct this study? Well, they had hundreds of bears that were brought in to an area that had barbed wire set up to snag hairs from those individuals. So it was a very non-invasive type of study. You know, we think of genetic studies of bears, and often we think of helicopters and radio collars and tranquilizing bears and handling them. And it's not very cost effective to do that, especially for a species. If you're thinking of a black bear, you know, they're not endangered, so you're not going to have a ton of funding to be able to conduct a study like this. But also it's much better for the bears, so they don't need to be tranquilized, and you might get a better sample size. So essentially what happened in the study is that there was a jerry can of rotted fish guts that was brought into the forest and poured onto the ground. And because it was all quite liquefied, it was a non-reward bait that brought those bears into that area. So the smell would have attracted them to where the barbed wire was, where they would just walk over it, and then some of their furs would be caught, but they wouldn't be injured because their fur is so thick. And then they would come and investigate the smell, but they weren't feeding those bears. They were just bringing them in via the sense of smell. So that was quite an interesting study. And I want to talk to you guys a little bit about, you know, the role that these bears have in this particular ecosystem, and, you know, and why we should care about them, and also the black bears and the grizzly bears. They're living in the Great Bear Rainforest that is largely it's very famous because of these bears, but also very much because of the salmon species that run up the streams there. So there's 5 different species of Pacific salmon that will run up the rivers, and anyone who's done a bear trip with us here would know that the bears play a really important role in bringing the salmon carcasses up into the forest. And scientists have also been able to find that the trees that are growing in the riparian area that are right beside the rivers in this place could be relying on that marine-derived nutrients very heavily. It could be 80% of the nitrogen that tree ends up taking up could be from the ocean. And we can infer from that it would be from salmon carcasses that are decomposing around those trees. And that could be true up to 300 to 500 meters from the riverside. And those trees could be growing 3 times faster than the trees in other areas. And so the bears are very much a catalyst for the environment in this way, that they are able to bring nutrients from the sea and bring it into a place that is actually typically quite nutrient poor because of how much rain is falling in these areas and just kind of washing through the soil profile and washing out the nutrients. And so, you know, when we're talking about conservation of a particular species or what their particular role is, that really is kind of the main role that these bears will play in this ecosystem is these fertilizers. But of course, it wouldn't be made possible if the salmon were not there. But there is this inextricable link between the bears and the fish, essentially. I'm going to quickly go through a couple of studies that were trying to determine basically why this gene has persisted, right? So we've figured out kind of how it's persisted and how the alleles work and where these bears are living, but like, what is the evolutionary advantage of being white? And this was a big question that was being looked at the University of Victoria. There were several researchers that were finding different ways to look into this. One was the creation of a study where there was a barrel, you can see it in the pictures here, that was covered in black and covered in white. And it was put into a salmon bearing stream. And then the guy sat on a ladder and recorded how close the salmon got to that particular barrel to see if the salmon had a positive or negative response to the color of, potentially the bear. And maybe there's a fishing advantage for these white bears. And some of the thought behind this was, if you think about being from a fish's vantage point looking up at a bear, if you're a big black bear that's casting a big shadow on a cloudy day, that might deter you more than if you're looking up and you've got a white bear that might not be making as big of a shadow and maybe is blending in more with the clouds. And sure enough, in this study, you can see here on the bottom of this graph, the color of the barrel and the color of the feet on the barrel was an indicator of how close the salmon would get to the barrel. And so we can see the barrel that had no body color but had white feet saw more salmon than the one that had a black body with no feet. And then again, the one that had a white body with no feet also saw more salmon than the one that had a black body and black feet. So it's interesting findings. I mean, there's some evidence there that there might be an evolutionary advantage to be white. Maybe those bears are slightly better fishers. Again, it's difficult to be able to completely make those assumptions having the data sets so particularly small, but this is one of the main ideas in the scientific community today. And there was a carbon isotope and nitrogen isotope study that was done on some more fur samples that were taken recently that kind of doubled down on this. And it showed that just like in the trees, the white bears, or the bears with the white allele, had a slightly higher density of that marine derived nitrogen by percentage in comparison to the black bears, the black bears. So that's pretty fascinating. I think that's pretty interesting. And then something else I'm going to mention is just something about the seasonal movements and some of the conservation concerns here, and then we can open up to some questions. So, I mean, the trips that we are running to the Great Bear Rainforest, they are done during the fall for a really important reason. That's because, if you're looking for bears, you want to be there at a time where they are more concentrated in one particular area, right? So it's during the salmon run, and you're hoping to encounter maybe a bear that's going to be looking for some salmon on the edges of the river. Now, that being said, in a mountainous and forested landscape with many, many, many rivers that are salmon bearing, it makes sense as to why it can still be really challenging to see these individuals as a tourist, especially if there's only maybe around 200 in that massive area, right? And maybe you end up seeing a black bear there that has the white bear gene, but there's no way of you knowing for sure unless you ended up getting a hair sample from that individual. And so it's a really special place, a really special thing to be able to come to these areas to look for this really rare creature. But of course, it's all about being in the right place in the right time. And yeah, it can be very difficult to coordinate an encounter. It just doesn't really work that way. But of course, this area has been seen internationally as is very, very special, and because of that, there's been millions of dollars that have been donated to an organization called the Safeguard of Coastal Carnivores, or Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. And what they've done is they have used that money to secure the commercial hunting tenures for much of the Great Bear Rainforest. So all of these areas in green and the blue one now as well have been acquired by this company or this organization. And it's a pretty genius route to conservation, because by using that funding to buy the hunting licenses, which are essentially guide licenses for trophy hunting of any carnivores in those areas, they've made a complete stop of trophy hunting in those places. Now, there's still like residential British Columbia hunters can come there, but in terms of people, paying a guide to come from an international area, it's just not happening in these polygons anymore. And it's pretty neat to see. It's a one way of direct action. And of course, as part of that tenure that they have, they need to bring people into those areas and go for a hunt, but they're just really, really bad at it. So they have never, reported any catches now that they have acquired these places. So there's really neat things happening in British Columbia in terms of conserving these critters. The grizzly bears as well. We've created a full hunting ban on grizzly bears in 2017, and we're hoping that continues to hold. And there's ongoing discussions between kind of the tourism industry and the hunting industry about how we're going to persist forward in this, and if we're going to keep those regulations. And we can see, I'll just bring us back to this map for a second, that there are some areas that are much more important for these animals than others, and it's really just a small little parcel of land that is special for specifically these white bears. The other thing that's really important if we want the white bears to continue to exist is that the salmon populations also continue to exist, right? Because they have this inextricable link. So this is something that we are struggling quite a bit with in British Columbia, and some nonprofit organizations have also kind of taken upon themselves to fill in the gaps. So if you look at the maps across the top of the screen there, the ones on the left side, the older maps, have many different colors on them: the blue, the green, the red, the yellow. Those colors are showing the different regions that one individual would be responsible for counting the salmon in that area. So we can see that there was 4 people who were in this region that were counting salmon in those places in Area 6 in the north coast of British Columbia. Come forward 10 more years, we only have 3 people. Come forward, 20 or 40 more years or so, we only have 2 people. And now we only have 1 guy. His name is Stan, who's responsible for counting the salmon in the whole north coast region. And of course, he can't count them all. And so we are really, really data deficient when it comes to the trends of our salmon population. We're relying heavily on what we call indicator streams, which are the ones that Stan can get to count. And then we extrapolate information from those streams onto the adjacent ones, even though if you know anything about salmon ecology, each particular river could have different impacts when it comes to depth and temperature and impact from logging and proximity to people, etc. So that's one thing that we're really working on in British Columbia. And I could tell you this, anyone who's from this area knows that it's very, very special, and we would really, really love to share it with anybody who's willing to come and listen. And just know that that many people come or are attracted to this area because of this whole idea of the white bear existing there, or the spirit bear existing there. But I think that people stay or will return for all of the other things that this place tends to offer. It's just really, really vast, intact wilderness where the ocean is extremely productive, and all kinds of whales will migrate there from Mexico and Hawaii for feeding. This great area for birds to be reproducing. There's breeding areas for birds and for the harbor seals, and of course the abundance of salmon. And I've even on trips that I've led where people have not seen the spirit bear, which certainly does happen because they are that rare, I have found that people tend to appreciate that being on the coast of British Columbia during the fall when the salmon are running is such an inextricable example of how the ecosystem is just so linked. Everything is so connected, and it's very, very clear. It's very, very apparent, and you are a part of it as you are visiting those areas. So yeah, it's an honor to be there, and it's an honor to talk about this region any opportunity that I can get. So thank you guys all for coming and listening.
All right, Marlo, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, that you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. If you go to the upper right hand, if you go to the upper right hand corner and click on those three lines, you can click there and it'll open up the menu, go to questions, and that's where we've got the questions. All right, so let's dive into the questions. So just to clarify, are there any formal protections afforded to the spirit bears?
Yeah, there are on Princess Royal Island and Gribble Island, the areas where the gene is very dense. There's a wildlife management area where you cannot hunt there for any bears, black bears or white bears. There's also parkland kind of mattered throughout that one of those maps that I showed you of the whole kind of region. And in those places as well, there would be some restrictions on hunting. But otherwise, there's many places in BC where very easily and actually quite cheaply as a resident, you could get a license to hunt and be hunting in an area where the white gene exists. Yeah. But because they are technically Ursus americanus, they're very much managed in that way. So if they're thought of just being one species, then they have a very, very healthy population, obviously across British Columbia, of being somewhere around 120 to 150,000. Yeah.
Great.
So we need more information so we can make more specific areas that there's no hunting of black bears at all. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you. So are there any plans to get Stan any help with counting the salmon?
Yeah. Well, Stan works for the federal government. Stan, the Department of Fisheries in Canada is the one who funds his type of work. And there are nonprofit organizations like Rain Coast, who I mentioned, and many of the indigenous groups along the coast that have taken it upon themselves to start gathering data. So there's been a groundswell of kind of grassroots citizen science happening, and some of it is actually quite official science associated with consulting groups that are hired by those organizations. So we're working as a coastline to improve the situation, but it is really challenging. And in Canada, just like in other places in the world, many of our environmental organizations aren't seeing really an increase in resources. Unfortunately, it seems to be kind of the trend in the opposite direction.
Are there any plans to use technology such as drone cameras to help with the counting process?
Yeah, the only thing is it'd be really challenging because the canopy is so dense. So drones wouldn't really help you because you can't see into the forest. And so that's one of the things that makes it so special if you do get an encounter of one of these bears is that, yeah, you really have to be at the right place at the right time because often you can't see very far around you unless you're on a river or an estuary or on the shoreline. But if you're in the forest, it can be very, very dense. So no drones yet that I've seen being talked about.
Thank you. So when do the salmon spawn? When does that come along? And is there one type of salmon that seems to be favored by the bears?
Oh, really good question. Yeah, so you'll notice this is different than some of the other bear trips that we run. The salmon arrive earlier in Alaska. So a lot of our bear trips there are in July, whereas in British Columbia on this section of coast, late August, early September is when the salmon really start to run, and you'll have salmon in the river until easily mid to late October. Obviously, where you sit on that in that time frame, the salmon are going to look a little bit different, right? When they first arrive, they're very bright and very lively, and the meat is generally much better both for people and for bears. It hasn't rotten quite as much, and then as we get further onto the season, you get salmon that kind of look like zombies, and they've had big chunks taken out of them, and they've already spawned out, and some of them are like missing an eye and they're still trying to swim. It's really wild. But you don't really see a huge preference across the species of bears for which salmon that they would choose. But there will be individuals that are very good at fishing that might be a little bit more choosy when it comes to the parts of the salmon that they're eating. So I've seen some bears that are really efficient at fishing that might only try to catch the female fish, the female salmon, and then they'll just eat the roe, or they'll just take a big bite out of the belly so that they got all the really fatty eggs, and then they'll just toss the rest of the carcass to the side and get the next one because they're that good at catching fish where the conditions are so good. Some bears really like the eyes, some really like the brain, some really like the skin. The salmon that the bears on our particular trips would be eating, that we would most likely see would be the pink salmon or the chum salmon. And largely that's because those salmon tend to spawn at lower reaches in the river. And so they're areas that we can get to. And also there are places that can be very effective fishing spots for those bears. But there are all 5 species of Pacific salmon that exist on the coast. There's a lot of parts to that question.
Well, thanks for tackling it. We appreciate it.
All good.
So how strenuous is this trip? Do I have to be in great shape to be on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more active than something like a polar bear trip. You know, a lot of our travelers have done polar bear trips. NatHab does their trip on a sailboat called Island Solitude. I believe that they have one this year also on Island Roamer. Anytime that you're on a sailboat, you do need to be at least a little bit limber, right, to be able to get on and off of the zodiacs to reboard the vessel. And so what that could look like is climbing up a short ladder sometimes, or just making a really big step back on board, and in a situation where there could be movement, right? Generally, we're in very calm waters on these trips, but yeah, someone who's able to move about if there is movement on board. And during these trips, we spend time looking for whales on board, which doesn't require that much activity, or we might do a little bit of hiking or kayaking in areas that are walkable, which, as you guys saw on the map, there's not a lot of like trails or roads, but there are a few places that you can go. And then there's really going to be one or 2 days that you are going to be in very close proximity to these 2 islands where the density of the bears, the white bear gene, is really high. And on that day that you have a meeting with the Git-Gat guide, which is the indigenous guide that would give our company the permit to go onto those islands and wait and see if we could see those white bears. That day can be very strenuous. There's a hike to get into the spot where we would sit and wait for the bear that is like quite uneven, and it is about a mile long or so. And what I've found is that, you know, we have many people that are walking in with us. Most of the crew from the ship will also come. So there's a lot of help available, but you certainly do need to be able to walk on uneven land as well if you want to go in for your day to go see the white bear, if it comes. Yeah.
What are the chances that we do get to see a white bear?
Yeah, I hate to put a percentage on it, but I will say that of all the people who will come to the region for all the companies in the fall to see the white bear, certainly not all of them will see. And there are some years where people do really well, and it might be, 75% of the trips get some type of viewing because there's an individual in the area that seems to be quite cooperative or likes to be very, very repetitive and tends to come down to the river quite often. And then we have other years where, wolves are moving onto the island and the bears seem to be a little bit displaced or a little bit nervous, and maybe a slightly lower percentage of the groups might see it. And certainly I've been out on the coast on seasons where it was probably about the 50% mark of groups getting a chance to actually have that encounter. It's really about being in the right place in the right time. And I think that something being that rare, it makes it very special when you do get the encounter, but also people do come kind of prepared for the wait as well. Yeah.
So how close would you say we get to the bears if we do see them, and what safety protocols are there for this adventure?
Yeah, really good question. In British Columbia, very interestingly, we have the Commercial Bear Viewing Association of BC. So every time that you are out viewing bears in BC, you have someone who's actually licensed to bring you to see bears. So they've been taught about bear biology and all the deterrents and how to keep people safe around bears, and it's standardized across the province. So it's statistically a very safe activity, especially when the salmon are running, because the bears are really interested in one thing, and that's making a living. They're in a phase of their year that they're just trying to get as big as they possibly can. So that makes them relatively kind of just docile and relaxed. And so there are times on this trip where you end up having a very close encounter where you're sitting on the edge of the river and the bear is in the middle of the river. Think of any like river or creek that you've been in. That's pretty close. That can happen, and your people could keep you very safe. And then there's other times where the bears that we encounter are at a distance, and that's just because they're wild animals and we don't get to control where they go. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Marlo. Unfortunately, that is going to be all the time that we do have for questions today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about this region, and I'd love to dive deep on any of these topics again in the future. And thank you everybody for listening. It's been a pleasure.
Marlo, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you'd like more information on how you could travel to try to see spirit bears with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you could send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.